Hi, my name's Rebecca. We are Young People Speak Up. This is Square Stories, the fun place to learn about our heritage.
In this session, we'll talk about the Blue Plaques, make our own awards and learn about William Glyn Jones, a famous author who wrote stories and spoke on the radio telling stories for children during the war.
So I'm Dennis Jones and I live in Llanelli. I bought my house in Llanelli in 2019, in June 2019, and moved in with my daughter. It's a normal terrace house in Llanelli. It sits on the top, just on the outskirts by the theatre in Llanelli, if you know the theatre well. I bought the house really because I quite like the house. It's the location fits me well, and I actually work sort of like in Llanelli also as well. It's a very unassuming house from the outside. I had no history with the house when I bought the house either. I bought it off an estate agent and a builder who renovated the property and moved in the June. I'd been in the house a couple of months and I received a letter via the post, and it was a letter which was an unusual letter because the letter was addressed to the house and not to me. And so the letter said, you know, the address on the letter, and it was beautifully handwritten via an ink pen also as well, which again is unusual. So I opened the letter with my daughter and was really quite surprised what was in the letter, because in the letter the letter was actually from the granddaughter of a Welsh novelist called William Glyn Jones, who had previously owned the house. And she was writing on behalf of actually her father, which would have been his son. And I had no history on the house at all. And she was able to fill me in on the history of the property and actually about the fact that, you know, the house was occupied 30 or 40 years actually by the Glyn Jones family. And that William had gone on to actually become quite a famous author within his own right. So it was just himself and his wife and the son that lived in the property, and I have actually recently last year, before we went into lockdown, had the privilege of inviting them actually for afternoon tea to the house. Because their son, the son is of age now, and Claudia was quite keen to come back and see the house, even though obviously the house had been remodeled, regenerated, etc. But they were actually quite keen to come back and view the inside of the property, and they've never been able to really do that before. So we had afternoon tea, and they were able to come and share sort of like their family story with me and my daughter about the history of the house, and we were able to do a tour of the house, and particularly the back garden. Whilst an extension had been purchased, the flagstones, for instance, outside that he recalled quite well, playing in the lane behind the house quite well, and also the front room where where the novelist wrote many of his books. He was born he was born in 1907 and died in 1977, aged only 69, which is quite young. He lived sort of like in London and actually died in London, but actually his early informative years, up until the age of his mid-40s, actually were spent in Llanelli. And he worked for the Glanamore Foundry in Llanelli, but was released on medical grounds. He had a cleft lip and struggled, if you could understand, with speaking. So he became a very talented writer. He was Welsh speaking, and in fact, many of his novels have actually been written in Welsh and often talk about the life, the early part of the century, isn't it, in Llanelli. He left his wife, and after he left the foundry, he left his wife and his son actually in Llanelli, and he moved to London to try and make, isn't it, a life for them then, isn't it, in writing, etc. in London. He spent many years during the war, World War II, actually in London writing. And in fact, when I spoke to Claudia, his granddaughter, she was able to, to tell of the wonderful stories of him actually writing in air raid shelters, and him becoming involved in what would have been, story time on the BBC and the World BBC service. He wrote for Children's Hour. He was published 12 children's books, many of which are bilingual also as well, and he wrote a number of novels also as well, and one of his earliest writings, which Claudia tells me was largely partly written in the front room of my house, actually is a novel called The Farewell to Innocence. And that talks about life in Llanelli, particularly working in the foundries, isn't it, during the 1930s, 40s. So it's obviously a very influential piece of work then, isn't it, at the time. And that's just recently in the last few years been reprinted also as well by Claudia. When he went up to London during the war, he survived sort of like living and working in London, wrote for magazines in London, the Mayfair magazine, for instance, London Standard as a newspaper, for instance, also as well as writing his novels, being on Children's Hour, and he became quite a well-known writer and poet. And more recently, his work has been shown actually on. There was a piece of work that was done in November of last year, actually with the Furnace, the theatre, and it was read by the broadcaster Alan Gibbard and writer Alan Gibbard, and it was on the Farewell of Innocence, and there are 10 series where you can listen, only 10 minutes they are, but you can listen, isn't it, to his readings, his life in Llanelli in the early days. So actually this became quite an interesting story for us, for myself and Charlotte, actually, because absolutely no idea. The family had been desperate for years. Dennis, the son, Claudia's father, is, of an age now where, they were desperate to try and, mark the occasion really, with a Blue Plaque Award for him as well, so that he's recognised, isn't it, for the work that he has done. There is a plaque actually in Llanelli Library, which as you go in through the east door, there's a plaque on the wall that shows, there's a bust of him, and it shows sort of like his linkage and his works of Llanelli. So the family were desperate to get the Blue Plaque, award up, and for it to be part of, the Llanelli Historical Society's Blue Plaque Trail, for instance, just depicting his work, and that, this be done obviously before, whilst Dennis was still with us. And, I was able to really sort of like say, that, I was happy for that to go ahead and permissions to be done. And actually, the town council actually funded some small scale monies actually for that Blue Plaque to be done. Blue Plaque hasn't been put up on the house yet. We're waiting for a time, isn't it, past COVID, that we're able to invite the family, and dignitaries and have an unveiling of the Blue Plaque, at the house. But we have I have been part of, the design in the Blue Plaque, and we will be situated in the front of the house. Some of his work was published in America, South Africa, Moscow, also as well, New Zealand, Australia. So we're really talking about an author here that, has global reference, really as well. But he's not very well known in Llanelli. And so, the Blue Plaque Awards really are a way of doing that, a way of educating his life story, and a way really of telling his family story, really. So, it's been a real long journey, and I think it's evidence that, when you buy a house, sometimes you don't quite know what the history of that house is.
We have written our own stories for children.